Welcome back to another episode of Just
Just
Squirrel
squirrel
Looking for a Nut,
trying
to get out of
of
this
rut. Well, I think we were a little bit deeper in the rut than usual that time. But you know what? We're still here. We're still alive. And I'll take a moment to just say I've recently come to, just in a very personal way, appreciate that. But after I say a brief hello to Jessica, who I'm glad is alive, I wanted to quickly ask you, Oleg, because actually I'll even step back a little bit further. I'm going to tell a little story here, which, by the way, I've been told you should never begin telling a story by saying, I'm going to tell a story. So just forget correct. I said that. Yeah. As you know, you poor suffering soul, Oleg Lougheed, my favorite book ever is The Book of the New Sun by the wonderful, amazing, brilliant literary sci-fi author Gene Wolfe. And because you did not share the love for that book, I'm actually going to give you a spoiler. In the first chapter of this book, the main character, whose name is Severian, falls into a river, blacks out, but he's pulled out. And then he goes on to a set of adventures. Many of those adventures appear to be life-threatening, but as is the case with all of these sorts of books, he somehow survives. However, at the very end of this book, it is pointed out to him that the character who is still surviving at the end, Severian, is actually a mere replica, a 3D sentient replica of that original Severian that died in the river in the first chapter. And in fact, Severian, other sentient replicas of that original Severian die throughout the novel. Whereas in the traditional heroic cycle, the hero appears to die or almost dies or something like that, but always manages to escape. In this case, the hero literally did die. None of the Severians whose adventures you're tracking in this novel actually were alive under any of our current definitions of life. Yet, this sentient artificial being who looked, acted, thought, and felt as if he were a human might disagree that he was not alive. Melody, I just wanted to quickly say hello and thank you for joining us again. But Oleg, hearing that very brief summary, do you think that the Severian at the end of that book truly was alive?
So full disclaimer in regard to that book, one of the reasons why I didn't choose to read it, for me, it was a very complicated book to begin with. I think there was a lot of, I think the language that we used with it was a little bit more advanced than the language that I'm used to reading books.
That's frightening considering your facility with language.
That's one thing. But I think for me, so this has been an interesting question that I've been trying to explore as far as what does it actually mean to be alive? Having had however many conversations and instances within my own life as well, personal circumstances where I was able to see life through someone else's lens, and then I was able to see how fragile life truly is. There are situations where I've seen people pass either by choice or without their choice as early as mid to late 20s, some in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So I think for me, how I interpret the question of what does it mean to be alive is I look at it through the lens of right now, having experienced life the way that I'm able to right at this particular stage, I feel more alive than ever before. The reason why I can say that is because I think, to me, what it means to be alive is the same thing as having a deep appreciation for life, having an understanding of what life truly is. I can't say I've had that realization until the recent years. I didn't always have the approach to life. I took life for granted many different times. Part of it, I think, is due to the fact that I was able to reflect upon yesterday. I was able to be in the moment today, and I kind of took the fact that tomorrow is going to happen anyway. But the reality of the matter is, tomorrow doesn't happen for everyone, and there's nothing about the next moment that is guaranteed. See, even how I even phrase that in saying that there is going to be a tomorrow starting at 12:01 a.m., when the reality of the matter is the next minute is not guaranteed. So that's what I started to understand, and that's how I understand this concept of what it means to be alive. Is when I started to develop a deeper appreciation for life and I started to express that, whether it was to myself and to other people, that's where I began to feel really alive and be a part of that process and a participant of life rather than an observer of it.
But Melody
Hmm.
walks into the ballpark
Yeah,
and shoots
it's winning. Yes.
right into right up beyond the field with the first statement. And it really, what she's asking in a way, I have to push back with you on.
Mm.
How do you know you're alive? Severian thought he was alive.
Well, I don't think there is. I don't think there's a universal equation to what it means to be alive. I think every single person, or maybe every single being, living being that has a heart or a heartbeat, I guess you could say through that lens. But then you could also even argue, well, are plants alive?
Yeah, microbial life.
So an argument could also be made there. You could also make an argument, are viruses alive because they're able to mutate from one to another? I mean, right now we're experiencing the perfect example of it, starting with one COVID variant, moving on to the next one, and then probably multiple other variants from that. So
Mhm.
that's where I think the question for me becomes a little bit more complex as far as understanding, well, what does it actually mean to be alive? Because at first I thought it was anything that had a heartbeat, but then that's not always the case. Plants don't share that, viruses don't share that. So it becomes interesting, but I'll say from a human experience point of view, how I've understood what it means to be alive is that I think everyone has their own different interpretation of it. I've heard people share experiences where they felt more alive when they were on the edge of a cliff. I felt people share experience when they were alive when they didn't have to work, or there weren't fears that were creeping into their mind saying you can't express yourself fully, or you can't be at peace, or some of these other things. So that's how I interpret the human experience. I don't know where to even begin in understanding the overarching perspective of it all.
Well, how would you react
Yeah.
if you found out that you actually were not alive? And you could not argue. Like, let's say you found out you were a ghost or that you were an AI.
I think it would be challenging to process. I think it would be very difficult to accept that as a reality because it would take away from my human experience. It would take away from what it means to be human and how I'm able to go through the different experiences on this earth. So it would have a significant impact on my meaning and what I choose to give meaning to. It would have a significant impact on the memories and the connections that I've had with people. So those are the things that come to mind immediately. At the end of the day, I would say it would probably put my whole human experience into it would leave you with a huge question mark. Am I even a human at that point? And what does it mean to be a human?
Jessica's last comment, and Jessica, you put two interesting remarks in there, but I'd like to focus on the second one briefly because it goes back to this same novel that we're going to be a little bit obsessed with tonight. In that novel, one of these Severians that believes he's alive and interacts in the world exactly as if he is alive, so we'll assume that he is alive, is a male. However, there is a ritual that he engages in which he takes a drug, and this is modeled on the Eucharist in Catholicism, and eats the body of someone who had previously died. And when he eats that drug with the body, the entire memory system of that human being enters into his brain and becomes a part of who he is. And it switches on and off during different parts of the novel. And so the person who he eats is a female with this drug. In fact, it turns out it was an ex-lover or someone he had a romantic relationship with. Mm-hmm. And there are parts of this novel where he is having conversations and experiencing things. And then later, people come up and said, how did you get here? I saw standing in your exact same place a woman talking. So he literally, by having the memories and the consciousness of this female inside of him, was imitating her, or female physically, to the extent that people thought it was a woman. Mm-hmm. How do you process that? And Jessica, Melody, y'all, or anyone else, y'all are free to answer that too.
I honestly, I wouldn't know where to begin. I wouldn't know where to begin because I think what comes to my mind is that it's such a complicated topic to begin with, and just, I guess, trying to understand how someone else processes it, what it means to be alive, or what they see. And let's say in a situation where you see one thing or one person and I don't see the same thing, does it make mine more or less alive compared to yours? So I'm in a similar boat as Jessica just described. her head hurts with this question, but that would be my honest response. Is I wouldn't even know where to begin in understanding how to process that. How would you process that?
It goes as to whether I would be alive or not, in that I wonder if, so there is being alive and not being alive. And usually we define the border on the downward threshold. And by downward, I will assume that there is
death,
here, right? Like life is up, and then after a certain threshold, you are not alive. And so what the state of your life is below the threshold.
Yeah.
However, if there were if we accept what I'm about to say, because Melody's remark about Z Nation actually goes as to this. Z Nation, for anyone watching this later, is about zombies. Mm-hmm. And zombies, from a theoretical perspective, actually create a very interesting question about the nature of life, because they eat, they move, they think, albeit in a very limited way. But the consciousness of the person that was there is gone. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, the situation that I described from Gene Wolfe's book is the opposite of that. You have not just your consciousness, but the consciousness of another. And so if we assume, which I don't know that I do assume, But
Mm-hmm.
let's say we assume that consciousness of some sort is a predicate to being alive, at least as we know it as humans. Let's leave aside plants for a second. That we know as humans, having two consciousnesses inside of you, to me, creates the possibility of a threshold above in which you are more than one living being while at the same time being one.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you have to be close to the concept of death in order to be alive, or in order for the concept of being alive be alive?
I
Is death the opposite of being alive?
That's a great question. Again, I will talk about another book that I read in the 70s. Karen Ann Quinlan
Mm-hmm.
was a woman who was in an auto accident. Something happened to her in the 70s. This was very controversial in the time. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a biography written about her by her parents. And she ended up in a coma, in a true vegetative state in which there was no hope for her future. And I don't remember everything about the book, except that the underlying debate was whether she should be continued to be kept alive in this state. And again, I put alive in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, the body is alive. But if there's no brain activity,
Yeah.
are they really? What is the difference, if any, between life as a physical experience and life as an experience that includes the physical and more? And the reason why I ask that, my friend Oleg,
Mm-hmm.
is that you're talking about things that put us really, when we say is when you're close to death, are you feeling more alive? It depends. Your body is no more or less alive. Perhaps you have heightened brain activity.
Yeah.
To the extent that death is an absence of brain activity, then maybe you really are alive, or
Mm-hmm.
more alive, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
But why do we think that? Why do we say when we're near death, or when I stood on the top of a mountain once and I looked at a fjord below me, and I was on a cliff and there was a town miles and miles and miles below, and the sun was shining. I could see mountains all around that town and mirages of water, of lakes, and I felt like a god. I felt more alive.
Yeah.
Why? Why is it that I interpreted it that way? What was I thinking, Oleg? Melody, anyone? Jessica?
So for me, I've had a similar experience like this when I was at the Grand Canyon, for example. And what I'll say is that the reason why I felt alive in a situation like that, or I guess you could say more alive than ever before, is first I was able to see the bigger picture, and I was able to see how small, not insignificant, but small in size compared to all of the things surrounding me were. So that was the first aware, point of awareness that I had. Is just this deep appreciation for being able to recognize all these things around me and know that I'm just a piece of the puzzle and I'm not always the puzzle, so to speak. I think living in the city and not having that um, perspective sometimes, that's what it creates for me, is that it doesn't give me many opportunities to see myself as part of a significantly larger picture or a significantly larger landscape. So that's one thing that I can speak to as far as what makes me feel alive, is the perspective that I'm able to gain from that experience. I think the other part is going back to your point about having to experience moments where dying is a real possibility. I can't say I've ever had anything very close to it. I've had some definitely close calls, so to speak, but I don't think anything as close to actually experiencing death, so to speak there. So what I will say is that, if anything, I don't know if it makes us feel more alive Rather, it just makes me feel more aware of the fear of dying.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it's the other that I'm experiencing that moment. I think if anything, what I'm experiencing, it's the fear of passing. It's the fear of
Mm-hmm.
life ending. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that's the same thing as feeling more alive, so to speak. Does that make sense?
It does. And I love the spontaneous insightfulness of it. It has convinced me that you really are alive.
Yeah.
Melody, you're saying remark after incredible remark here. It's thank you. And Jessica, don't be silent for so long. I want to just check in and make sure you're alive. So interesting. Melody, you say that, and this is not a view that is unique to you. And I, frankly, being really candid with anyone who might be listening to this, don't agree with what I'm about to say. I'm gonna just say it anyway, because why not? Melody, you say we are a soul living in a physical body. One, why do we feel that?
How do
Two,
we know that?
how do we know that? Two, is the soul what is alive, or is it the body? Is the soul something else besides alive? And the reason why I ask that very specific question is because part of the how we experience life on this planet is tactilely, if there's such a word. We have senses that we perceive through our organs. We have eyes, taste, feel. We interact with the world through touch or through language or through those senses. What we define as life ends universally. There's nothing that I know of that is immortal or immune to death. A soul is not that, unless souls die. And there are some Christian theologians I know that believe that. But let's assume that souls don't die.
Mm-hmm.
Is it alive then? Was it alive? Is God a living being? If that's something that you believe in, or if you believe in deities, are deities alive as we know them, or are they something else? And by the way, by saying that they're not alive, I don't mean that as a diminution,
Mm-hmm.
but is our definition of life, or is the very concept of life too narrow to encompass something like that?
Yeah. Well, I that's where, kind of going back to the earlier remark that I had made at the beginning of this, how I understand as being alive, it does mean having some sort of heartbeat. Because even the concept of a
Mm.
soul, I mean, if you think about it, this is how I think about it. If I break it down into concepts, soul, in my opinion, is not a universal truth. What I mean by that is I don't believe. So a universal truth for me, an example would be 2 + 2 = 4.
Mm-hmm.
Across any culture, across any region, that is going to be the result, regardless of the language, regardless of the
Mm-hmm.
culture that's looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
A soul, I don't think, is the same concept.
Mm-hmm.
A soul, I think, if anything, it's a personal belief that one chooses to subscribe to. So you may believe that there's a soul, I may not believe that there's a soul, and yet neither one is right or wrong according to our beliefs. So I think, if anything, what I'm starting to understand is, maybe at the end of the day, at least in my opinion, the only thing that is alive is my physical body, my heart, all of the different components of my body that are able to help me create this experience. So that's probably the only thing that I could control and I could understand. I think, if anything else, all the other things are based on the individual beliefs. Some people believe in afterlife. Are you alive after you pass? For how long? Eternity? Do you ever pass? So That's where the question becomes even more complicated. So if anything, what I'm learning is that I think much of the answer to this question depends on the individual experience of how you choose to interpret it.
Do you ever think about those stories where at the end of someone's physical life,
Hmm.
they suddenly realize that everything that they thought about the nature of their existence was wrong? Either they suddenly realize, oh, there actually is a hell and I'm going to it, or there actually is an afterlife and I never believed in it, or they realize they've thought their whole life that there was an afterlife or that there was some supreme power, and on their deathbed they realize that there's nothing at all.
Um, trying to think through my experience. Probably, I probably have had conversations like that. I have probably experienced moments like that myself. I don't really want to go down this rabbit hole, but while the topic is up, might as well throw it out there. A couple years ago, I heard of this theory of flat Earth, for example. So, that's a topic. Personally speaking, from my perspective, and I don't mean to pass judgment onto anyone else, but I have a harder, I have a more difficult time subscribing to that theory. I think part of the fact has to do with me being exposed to so many different theories and methodologies that disprove that particular concept. But at the same time, theoretically speaking, having not traveled into space and having not seen the Earth myself, I guess you could say that theory could be true, according to whoever views it. Even with the latest Richard Branson video outside of space looking at Earth. The fact that I personally haven't done it, yeah.
Well, and Melody acknowledges, Jessica, you are being a brat. That's why I love you. Don't be any other way, please. We're not going to forget that little bratty remark you made.
But it's an interesting point that she makes if you really think about it, because she's talking about the concept of 2 + 2 = 4, and someone else came up with that is two is said two. So aren't we just subscribing to it? So to the example that I just brought up, I think it's the same exact thing. I mean, I guess you could say this to be true about many things. Don't we isn't that what just happens? We just subscribe to different beliefs without really having experienced it ourselves, either due to a lack of time or due to a lack of experience. I mean, anything that has happened in history prior to us being alive, you and I are subscribing to how the history is told to us based on the people that we choose to take that information from, which is probably different. You probably have received information from different people compared to the people that I've listened to, compared to the people that Jessica, Melody, and anyone else who has listened to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated in trying to understand, well, which of those are quote unquote true and which of those moments actually happened and which of those moments happened due to our interpretation of them happening.
And that does go as to Melody's last remark, actually.
Yeah.
Yesterday, for my Purpose Highway podcast, we released an episode with an ethicist by the name of Jonason Goldson. Really, really smart guy. And one of the things that he emphasized, which we say is a cliche, but it really goes as to even more of an existential and ethical layer than how a cliche commonly goes, and goes as to what you're talking about, Oleg.
Yeah.
The past. It is true. What is the past? We only have in place because of a common agreement as to what it was, which, by
Yeah.
the way, isn't always that common. And none of us really do 100% know, because especially if it was before we were born or something that we didn't witness, we just weren't there. We can deduce it based on the best available evidence. And there are interpretations that are unreasonable or so unlikely as to be vanishingly impossible to the point of any likelihood of them occurring being beyond the vanishing point.
Mm-hmm.
But be that as it may, this common agreement, no one says that that actually was right. Jonason points out that, and this is a superficial answer, those that the victors, he doesn't frame it this way. The common cliche is that victors write the past. The past is written by those who won whatever conflicts are defining history. Now, what he points out is that the power to write the past really contains the power to write the future. And those who truly understand the way and have the desire to control the future and understand how to do so, make sure that they are writing the past in a way that's favorable to their agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that conversation with me and him was about the ethical obligation that comes when we describe the past and the ethical obligation to be truthful about it, because the implications for the future are far beyond us. Here is an example. Well, an example is the whole Civil War.
Yeah.
And how that, the implications
World Wars,
of how people are,
Holocaust.
But I use the Civil War in particular here because the Civil War in the United States, for anyone who might be listening outside of the US, really goes as to the heart of race relations in this country, which is an ongoing issue that is ebbs and flows and is an ongoing flashpoint. And so who is defining what happened in the Civil War, who's writing it, what the truth really is, or what we agree the truth to be or not to be, actually has moral and ethical implications, because it goes as to how we treat each other forever. Mm-hmm. What is racial equity? How were African Americans treated? How much responsibility do whites bear? Mm-hmm. How much benefit do whites receive from privilege? All of those go as to who is writing that past, what that past and what our agreements or lack thereof mean about it.
Do you think we're all contributing to that history, or to the rewriting, or maybe writing of new elements of that history?
I would argue yes, even if we think we're not. Mm-hmm. Trivializing our own importance. That's another thing I got out of that conversation with Jonas and Goldson. Trivializing our own role, particularly with regards to ethical issues, and especially in a free society such as ours, is a dangerous, dangerous game. And we've hurt ourselves in this country because we have refused to take true, radical ownership of our ethical choices.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you on a couple of remarks that you had made. I think the first one is, I don't know, I personally don't subscribe to the theory that the history is written by victors, so to speak. I think, in my opinion, everyone has a role in history, and it boils down to how that history is told and how it's interpreted ultimately. Because you can have one interpretation of it, I can have a completely different of it, and then the question for me becomes, well, who's right, or is there such thing as being ultimately right, or is the truth, at least at this point and how I understand it, is it just simply a multi-layered thing that ends up happening over time? Now, I will say that I think there is something to be said about being alive in this particular day and age and experiencing everything that I have experienced through my own eyes and living on this planet, I will say that even with all of the resources that are available right now to document history and to write new history and to rewrite certain elements of the past, I think it's becoming even more challenging to do so. I think one of the reasons why is because platforms like this, platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook, any other social media platform, what it does, I think it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. And that is, it gives the space to for people to be able to process what they have seen and how they interpret it. But at the same time, depending on what influenced those things and what influenced the way that they were a part of that event, it may not always be the same way that the person next to them saw it. So it's hard. I think for me, what I'm learning is that it's harder to really figure out what is the ultimate truth to any event. I guess if anything, what I'm choosing to do and how I'm understanding is, to me, the truth is whatever I believe to be true. That's how I interpret it.
That
'Cause I don't know if I can't really think of any other way to do
that
so. It's
terrifies me, though.
Yeah.
Jessica, by the way, yes, I think that you're right. There is an episode where the question proves the title of this show.
Yeah.
And then Melody, what I'm about to say goes as to your last comment,
Mhm.
because if anyone that has seen the miniseries Chernobyl
Yeah.
will attest to this. If we say there's a line in that
Sure.
where one of the Soviet governors, or whatever the title was, the government official in that particular, in the nearby town,
Yeah.
when he's given news that this has been a deadly disaster, because of the fact that he was invested in the idea that the Communist Party was always right, he says to the scientists, I choose my reality versus yours. Meanwhile, people are keeling over dead from radiation sickness, vomiting right in front of him. And saying that we believe what we choose to believe, as opposed to choosing, or as opposed to facing things that we don't want to believe, no matter how devastating they are, is, to me, opening the door to that sort of lesson.
So how can you choose a reality you don't believe in then?
Where does logic play a role?
Mhm.
Where does, as Melody mentioned earlier, she didn't say it directly, but when she says what she believes in, the soul, the chakras, these sorts of things, she says the things have changed the more she learns. At least embedded in that is the concept that lived experience is informing what she is, what her belief system is.
Mhm.
Melody, please correct me if I'm wrong. And I think that weighing of these things with an honest assessment of our ability to self-delude
Mhm.
is a big deal. I think a lot of people have this idea in their head, well, I believe it, so it must be true, and they get entrenched in it.
Mhm.
And or they're not willing to, or their ego, or whatever issue they might be facing, says, I can't be wrong. Oleg,
Mhm.
I've believed so many things for so long
Yeah.
about myself, about others, only to have been proven wrong, to my regret.
Mhm.
And so, choosing to believe my own reality, well, maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I shouldn't have.
How are you going to process your experience then? How are you going to understand this whole concept of what it means to be alive if you don't fully believe your reality?
We never actually see
Mm-hmm.
or truly experience the universe. That's a scientific fact.
Mm-hmm.
We only perceive through the filter of our brain the actual reality within which we live.
Mm-hmm.
The best I can do is accept it, but with the understanding that my perceptions may be limited.
Mm-hmm. So what I'll say is I don't know. I'll challenge what you said in a couple ways. First is I think, and the reason why I say that is because for me it's just a harder topic to
Mm.
grasp my head around. I think there is a big difference between, as Jessica pointed out, understanding what your truth is compared to the universal truth. So the topic that we spoke about earlier when we were talking about the soul and the body, the universal truth could be the body because we're all able to see it. The soul, I think, at least my experience of it, there, I had to go through another experience to understand what soul could possibly look like. So I don't think it was one of those given experiences. But what I will say is that even though there is 100% danger in that concept of accepting your own truth as the ultimate truth, yes, I agree with that. The one that I am trying to understand is in knowing the fact that every single one of us, I believe, have our own truths. And then there's also, I guess you could say, the universal truth, which is not always as clear or evident. Jessica brings up a really good point as far as some of the other hot topics right now.
Yeah.
Dealing with COVID-19,
Yeah.
going back to the theme that we've covered for however many episodes by now. Is there a universal truth? Is there a universal way to deal with it? Apparently not, because so much of it depends on the region. So much of it depends on the stages that the region is experiencing. And so much of it depends on who the person is responsible
Mm-hmm.
of distributing information,
Mm-hmm.
prevention, treatment, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I think it raises another interesting point or a question about it all, as far as how do you respect someone else's truth in knowing that that is simply how they're seeing the world through their lens, and they may not be the universal truth, and still respecting it as their truth and maybe not your truth.
Well, how do you do that and acknowledge the fact if you agree to acknowledge it?
Yeah,
Sometimes people lie.
that's an
They lie
additional
to
step as
others
well.
and to themselves.
Correct. And sometimes people, due to a variety of reasons, create a different version of the truth.
Yeah.
I think there was an experiment. You might have actually told me this about this experiment however many months ago, where uh, I I don't know if it's a case study of an actual thing that happened or a hypothetical situation, but there was a car crash, and they asked the bystanders what color the car was, and
Mm.
depending on where the person were standing and what they were doing before and what was influencing them before, each and every single one of them gave them a different answer. Now, when the person
Wow.
had reframed the question, and I think it was framed something in the way of, "Did you see the red car?" I'm almost positive that every single one of them said yes, the car was red. So it's that, but it goes back to your point, right? Is how much, what is the role of our memory, and does it actually serve us to the fullest capacity and accuracy when it comes to recalling certain events, and how many times does false memory take over and other influences become so great and significant that we create other meaning from the things that we might have actually experienced and been a
Yeah,
part of.
Yeah, and that I wonder if the sort of thinking that's behind Jessica's most recent remark. There is truth to what you just said, by the way. I know that from the practice of law because of the fact that witnesses give varying
Mm-hmm.
testimonies. And eyewitness evidence in a trial context is weird. Juries believe eyewitness testimony, although it's actually far and away the least reliable that there is. People say, oh, the only evidence of a crime or something happened is circumstantial. Actually, circumstantial evidence is usually the best. Really is. It's not disputable. It's not in dispute usually. It is clearly not influenced by memory failures or by personal bias, that sort of stuff. When you hear on TV someone saying, oh, they can't be convicted because all the evidence is circumstantial. Oh, yes, they can be convicted. And sometimes there is there's a lot more justification for convicting someone based on circumstantial evidence. And as we know from the many cases of false convictions based on mistaken
Yeah.
identity, eyewitness testimony is terrible. Jessica's statement around that goes as to that perhaps there isn't. Although in the case of those mistaken identity people, many of whom have gone to the death, to the electric chair based on that.
Well, also think about situations where, and I don't know if you've ever had to deal with cases like that. I certainly haven't because I haven't had the privilege and the honor to be a lawyer just yet. But
I don't know.
having
That's you living in your own reality when you
yeah,
describe it as a privilege
having
and as an honor. It's not. It's in my reality.
having
It's a horror show.
having seen Blue Bloods and Criminal Minds and some of the other shows where I was able to be a active participant in those episodes and really dissect the evidence. What I've also found fascinating about many of the cases that I was able to see, and this directly relates to our initial topic of how do you know if you're alive and what does it actually mean to be alive, is looking at cases where, let's say, it was a family member who had either been in a wreck or killed someone by accident or intentionally or whatever it might be. And then you see other family members or relatives stepping up and trying to defend the other individual so they don't face whether it's life in prison or the max possible sentence for that. So that's where I think for me it also becomes interesting to explore, and that is how far are people willing to go to keep someone else alive, even if it's a situation where they know that they are not telling the truth on their behalf, but rather that they're telling the truth that needs to be heard in order to convince the other party so that the person that's closest to them can be alive, can be well, and can still be in their presence rather than having to experience. I mean, there was another story. I don't know if you heard about this but while we're on this rabbit hole, might as well reveal it there. Aaron Hernandez. You remember that? Do you remember his case?
Of course, yeah. But rehash it for those that might not be familiar with him.
I don't remember the full story. I watched it a couple years ago, I think by now. But here was a individual who played in NFL, and he had committed multiple murders, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Multiple murders, and was able to get away with them. And it wasn't until later on in his career, and in fact, I think after the second or third murder, he had received like a $40 million contract or something like that from New England Patriots. And then later on, he was convicted guilty and stuff like that. But that is another example as far as how far some of the people who might have been involved, part of those acts, were able to tell a different version of the truth, so to speak, or their version in order to preserve his being and help him be alive instead of facing.
Did he end up killing himself, by the way?
He did, I think so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
which is that's another great topic is how at what point would you consider not being alive?
So before we get to that, we'll do a little trigger warning.
Yeah.
So consider yourself potentially triggered within the next half an hour or so. let's talk about the first situation.
Mm-hmm.
As usual, my husband has something to say about everything. And his reality tends to be the accurate one. I'll just put that out for all of y'all to accept, including you, Oleg. Don't even try and argue. His reality was that if my ass ever ended up in jail, this shit was over. I was single again. So I can tell you this. I have no doubt he loves me and he loves me unconditionally, but I don't think he'd go so far as to I have a feeling he wouldn't go so far as to jeopardize his own life or his own integrity to
Mm-hmm.
keep me from having to pay for murder. And I respect that about him. He can love me all he wants, and he does, but I wouldn't. His unconditional love is based on me being who and what he thought I was. And if it turned out I was someone completely different and just presenting a facade and was going around slaughtering people, then I think that he rightfully would say, well, my unconditional love was based on a lack of conditions with me thinking who you are, not you being something completely else altogether. But not only that, he's very ethical, and I believe that he would have a problem sacrificing his ethics, something that he views as the core of his humanity, just so I could get away with murder.
Right.
And I don't know that he would ever feel safe with me again, by the way. And that goes as to why I would have a hard time really protecting someone who I felt was committing a grave unethical act, because I would never feel safe with them myself, outside of the fact that it's wrong, and I would feel diminished as a human being.
Yeah.
Now, going a little bit more deep, the movie The Road. Melody, maybe you've seen that because it seems like you might have an affinity for this sort of movie. In that movie, an asteroid hit the planet. Life is dying.
Mm-hmm.
Viggo Mortensen and Charlize Theron, or however you say her name, play the parents of a child that managed to survive this catastrophe. When my husband and I saw this, the husband, Viggo Mortensen, is the ultimate survivor. He lives on that planet on Earth in this bleak hellscape until the bitter end. Meanwhile, his wife is like, there's no hope. This is not what I consider being alive.
Mm-hmm.
Ciao. And she kills herself. When I saw that movie, I thought, how horrible. How could she not want to survive? What kind of person is this? What is her problem? This was an early aha moment that my husband and I had together. And he said, I can relate to her. If it's bad enough, I don't see the need to stick around.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Scott. I'm going to meet my own interests. If it's that bad, I'll leave and I won't have any regrets about it. So those sorts of things, if it's enough physical pain, or I would argue if there's a lack of hope, probably, maybe that's when the instinct to survive, at least in our physical body, may end.
Mm-hmm. Well, couldn't you also say that maybe one of the reasons why you had that perspective is due to the fact that you might have a bias for growth?
I hadn't seen that connection.
You know,
I would say that's probably is 2 chapters of the same book.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant observation, Oleg.
And the other thing that I'm thinking about is in regard to that same topic of having a bias for growth, because I experience a similar thing, is how often I choose to associate that with the concept of being alive. Being alive meaning to progress forward, take the next step, keep going, keep going, keep going. When the reality of the matter is, I guess what I realize sometimes is that growth doesn't always happen like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's growth that happens from the times where you don't do anything. And I guess you could argue that theoretically you are still doing something, even in moments when you are not doing anything. And that's
Mm-hmm.
whether it's reflecting or whatever it is. So that's a question that could be argued in many different ways. But that's what I also find interesting, is that how that there's a connection oftentimes that I've made between having my own bias for growth and having that be associated with being alive. And when I don't experience growth, I don't feel like I'm alive. But then at the same time, it's like that's not even always true, because when I'm on that, as you were describing earlier, on that mountain peak, I'm not moving, I'm not progressing, I'm not doing anything to move forward, and yet I'm still able to experience that feeling. Where does it come from? Why is it there?
Melody has something in common with Beyonce. She's a survivor. And yes, I guess the conversation is sort of looping back, Jessica. Tell us something that maybe has brought out a different wrinkle in your thinking around this topic, though. Oleg,
Mm-hmm.
do you believe, on the topic of growth,
Yeah.
that you are a baby soul, a young soul, a mature soul, an old soul? Jessica and Melody, I'd be curious as to what you think you are too.
So I've been told that I'm an old soul. I think part of it is just due to being the age that I am, but having a different perspective compared to that age. I don't know how I understand it, because I don't know. I personally don't choose to subscribe to the timeline of age to begin with. I don't believe that anyone who's older than I am is necessarily wiser than I am. I don't believe anyone that's younger than I am is necessarily any worse than I am, because I've met people who are 14, 15, 16 years old who have completely different perspectives than I do, and are able to see the world and some of the processes that I go through on a daily basis through a more productive and a more effective lens. So I personally, I don't subscribe to that process. I don't believe there's anything that is guaranteed with age. I think that applies to experiences. I think that applies to wisdom. I think that applies to perspectives. In my opinion, all of those things are earned. I earned perspective through my ability to be open. I learned perspective through my ability to constantly learn new things, to be challenged in ways that I haven't done so before. I've gained experience by making conscious choices to create certain experiences within my life. I've also gained experiences, or yeah, I've gained experiences by situations where I didn't oftentimes make the choice. Let's say the choice was made for me by those surrounding me or people that I trusted. So that's where I think I don't fully subscribe to that concept of a timeline, partially because of the fact that I don't believe anything about that timeline is guaranteed. That's my opinion of it. How do you view that?
I was told once that I was a mature soul, but not an old one yet.
What's the difference? Well, I guess like what?
How, I'm sure Melody could clarify this, but as I understood it, just the phase in the level of learning that soul has, or their advancement in whatever cosmic ladder that there might be. And Jessica first says we're making her soul old. Jessica, I just love you. And then next she says that she's regressing. I'm kind of like that too, Jessica. Isn't it fun?
Hmm.
But I wonder whether if anyone ascribes to the idea of a soul being old or young or whatever, that they are whether you are or not. I get fascinated by these things. Melody says the age of a soul refers to how many lifetimes it's had. I also, by the way, was told that I had a pale yellow or clear aura. I was disappointed by that. I wanted to have some color that I like. My least favorite, I was imagining my aura as being the same color as the urine of someone who's very well hydrated.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't I have had a cooler color than that? Have you ever had your aura read, Oleg?
No, never have.
What about you ladies or anyone else? Why? I want to know this. I'm fascinated by it. But
I
while we talk about that, I want to talk about something else. So you referred to growing up.
mm-hmm.
I hope I'm not busting your stuff out
Mm-hmm.
by saying that you grew up in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
At least you were born there and you spent a significant amount of your childhood there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you later came to the US. Is that a secret that I wasn't supposed to share?
No,
Okay,
it
good.
is not anymore.
Okay. Well, you can scold me later. I'll take it. And Jessica says that hers is red, like Donna. Jessica, how come you get to have the cool disco flavored Donna Summer aura? And I want to know what that means. So, in any event, Russia, as I understand it, is a much less spiritually inclined country, particularly when you grew up, which was in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse and
Yeah.
Soviet
Mm-hmm.
Union, as we both know, enforced atheism
Mm-hmm.
on penalties that were quite severe. And so my question for you also is this whole concept of soul. Was that something you even had or heard of before you came to the US? And if so, what was it like absorbing that?
I don't think my life was any different in not having. So when I lived there, I didn't. That wasn't a topic of conversation as far as do people have a soul or
Well, wait a
how
minute.
is
I've got
it
to ask, like
different?
when we were a child here in the United States, many, if not everyone, but many people, for instance, learn prayers before they go to bed at night, right? Like
Yeah.
you pray to God to make sure that you wake up the next day, even when you're a little toddler.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember how that part of the process would handle. Maybe there were some things like that. I know that at least the town that I was in, there were many churches surrounding us, so I know that there was some concept of religion and belief in the town that I was from. For me, how so it wasn't until I came to the United States that I started to fully understand concept of a soul and what it means to have one and what it might mean to not have one. I think when I was living in Russia, it was more so pointed towards your heart. So the
Uh-huh.
remarks were made about having a good heart, being a good person, listening to your heart, and understanding that language. The thing that I've been somewhat puzzled by, and I'll be curious to hear your perspective or anyone else that's listening right now, in regard to the age of your soul or the lifetime of your soul. Why is it that, at least my interpretation of it, and I'm going to project this onto everyone else, but why is it that it's harder for me to see the lifetime of my soul, but it's not for someone else? Have you do you know what I'm saying? With me
Yes.
asking you the question of how old is your soul, why is it harder for you to answer, but yet I might be able to see it through the interactions that I have with you?
Oh, like, are you kind of BSing though? I think you know you've got an old soul.
I don't know if I've been told that I have an old soul, but I can't really. I don't know how to process
But
that. What
don't
does
you
that feel like?
see? But can't you figure that out? Didn't it occur to you when you were younger, like in high school, that there were
Well,
certain. Go ahead.
I had more. I would say, yeah, I had different perspectives, and I might have had. I guess you could say I might have been more advanced when it came to certain life experiences that I was able to have, but other people weren't able to have. But that's just that even now when I'm told I have an old soul, I don't really know. I know what it means in theory, but it doesn't feel any different.
Jessica has a good explanation for it, I suppose, and thank you for that, Jessica. While we're putting that up for folks to look at, Melody, yellow aura is from the solar chakra. That's interesting. I have to look up. I don't know a lot about chakras, but I do know that ever since I was a child, I've been obsessed with Helios, the sun god, or alternatively sometimes Hyperion. But in one way or another, in Indian mythology or Indian belief, Surya is my favorite. I've always associated myself with the sun god. So that's very interesting that that would come up. Don't you, though, feel like as much as you can't see yourself, don't you kind of get a sense? I mean, I kind of get a sense. Sometimes I know I'm off. And Jessica, I'm teasing you a second ago, but I'm very serious. I think that you're right. We are sometimes caught in biases about ourselves. But for instance, I know that certain things about myself are not the same as other people, not necessarily better or worse. I know, for instance, my math skills are not as good as many people's.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of know, based on how people react to me in the world or whatever, that my voice can get attention if I choose to use it that way. I like to think that we're not so, the sort of people that are engaging in these conversations are not so separated from the world mentally that we don't notice that there are personality characteristics that are different. And the reason I say that is because to me, it's so obvious that you're an old soul. It's hard to, it's just, and that's maybe a limitation and the bias on my end.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine that you could seriously just have no clue whatsoever that why anyone would say that.
Well, I mean, I understand those things. I understand those correct characteristics about myself. But what I don't fully understand is, and maybe this goes to my limited understanding of what a soul is, are those things part of your soul? Are they your soul? Is your voice your soul?
No, it's a physical characteristic that I choose
Okay.
to leverage sometimes.
So how, well that's my question. I don't know if it's necessarily, it's a more complicated question, so bear with me here, but I understand those characteristics. I understand my ability to be able to listen to other people, to understand them in a different way that someone else is able to understand them, to communicate certain things. I get those things. What I have a harder time wrapping my head around is understanding the lifetime of a soul that I'm experiencing in the moment and how that's projecting to other people. So people will tell me you have an old soul, but to me, there's no emotional connection that's being made in that moment where I immediately like, oh yes, I do. And I think partially it's because I don't fully understand that. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means to that. Does it mean that I have more perspectives, different perspectives than others, more advanced perspectives? If anything, maybe yes, I've had different experiences, but the same is true of other people. And maybe I have different ways that I've processed those experiences. I do understand that about myself, having the ability to process experiences. But I don't know. Maybe that's a topic for another conversation, but maybe not. Maybe you can draw a connection there.
I understand what you're saying. I was not surprised when I was advised that I was not an old soul. I would have been very surprised if I had heard that. Maybe some of that is because of purely observation of how people react to me in the world. I have never had in my entire life anyone say, Scott, you're an old soul.
Yeah.
So perhaps it makes sense to me when I'm given a description of my soul's likely place on the journey. Yet another person says says basically you're not an old soul.
Yeah, you got room to grow.
I've got room to grow. My soul
polite way of
Needs
saying it.
right, and my soul needs some
You
potty
have some
training.
things for improvement. That's funny.
Is that why you're always looking down on me, Oleg?
No,
Yeah.
I just told you that I don't understand that I'm an old soul, but supposedly I am. So
Well, how does it feel when you hear that you're an old soul? Does that make you feel? And Jessica and Melody, like Melody, how did it feel when you heard you were an old soul? I'm sure someone told you that before. Jessica, well, how did it feel? How would it feel if I told you you are a soul in regression?
I mean,
Getting
for
some
me,
whiplash.
it doesn't feel any different. It really doesn't. I guess I interpret that as a compliment whenever I'm told that. But if I'm being honest, it really doesn't feel any different. It doesn't feel like an achievement. It doesn't feel like a milestone or anything like that. So I'll take it as a compliment, but I don't even know what I'm complimenting in that moment. But I think it goes back to Jessica's point, and that's something that I try to not try, but do actively from one time to another, and that's try and give or find reasoning behind everything. Try and figure out the why, the how, the what, the when behind all of it in order to be able to understand that experience. And I do agree with her that in certain situations, just letting go of the process of trying to make that thing tangible, so to speak, that's where I probably get even a better understanding of it all. So that's how I understand it.
Melody has an explanation as to why people might react this way to you. I
Yeah.
agree. I actually agree. Again, you sort of know yourself. I can, or let's hope you do.
Yeah.
I,
But
I
isn't
think.
that,
Oh,
can't
go
you
ahead.
also make an argument that isn't that a limitation that we set upon people
What,
saying
being
that,
wise?
no, 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 no
Good.
limitation that you have to know certain things before a specific age?
I don't think that there's necessarily judgment attached to it. I just think that the typical individual develops levels of maturity at certain phases. Some don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some do much more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I also agree. I find you wise beyond your years. In many ways, I find you wiser than I am. In fact, again, many words have been used to describe me in my life, most of which I'm comfortable with. I have to say,
Mm-hmm.
being called wise, that's a novelty. And not only, I've never heard it myself described that way. And if I were described as wise, I actually, how do you feel if when you're called wise? I would take umbrage to it. I would react negatively. But I take it, I assume you don't, or do you?
So, uh, good question. I think I've definitely been described using that word. I can't really think of any particular situations as far as what my reactions were. I will say that I am drawn to some words over others. I think a lot of it has to do to my experience, maybe usage of it, and how comfortable I am with those words. For example, good listener, someone who is caring, someone who's a connector, those words that come to top of mind,
Mhm.
someone who's respectful, those are the words that I feel
Mhm.
a deeper connection with compared to some of these other words. For example, being wise. And the reason why is because I think those words are part of my everyday vocabulary. So not only in the things that I speak, but also in the things that I do and in the things that I'm able to experience from other people. So that's where I have a significantly deeper connection to those topics compared to the topics of wise or smart. It's another one. I know I'm smart, but I don't have as deep of a connection than, let's say, a good listener. And a lot of it I think also goes back to what do you choose to associate yourself with? What
Do
makes
you
up
choose? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of it boils down to what makes up your identity.
Well, are you choosing to associate yourself with identities, or do you choose to, or are those identities that after a while you hear so much, you're like, well, as they would say about Bon Jovi, this hair metal
Mhm.
band in the 80s, 6 million people who bought the record can't be wrong. Maybe it is good. I couldn't stand Bon Jovi. Jessica, if you hate me for not being able to tolerate Bon Jovi, we'll take that outside.
Huh. So here's how I process that. I don't process that the same exact way. For me, I'm at a point where it doesn't matter how many people say a certain thing. I still have a choice in accepting that as a part of my reality and my identity. That's how I process it. Now, I'm not you or one could make an argument that okay, there's a danger to that because can you ever be wrong? For example, if 500
Mhm.
people told you that hey, this is not the correct way to do it. That's not what I'm saying. I do accept other people's realities and times where I am not right according to the situation. But I will say that there's certain elements where I will listen, but I also understand that I will listen, but I also understand that there's a choice that I can make in what I
Jessica,
do.
I love to love you, baby, too. And Melody, I have a lot of love for you. Well, Oleg, I would be curious as to how this conversation would go. Now, there are times when the isolated person will describe you in a way where, at least in my experience, I'm like, you've got some judgment issues. I don't know what who or what you're talking about, but that description you had of this person out there, that had
Yeah.
nothing to do with me. That does happen, and I would say that in those cases, I would agree with you. Describing my personality or the characteristics that might make me a less than old soul. Sometimes I feel like people can see things, as Jessica mentioned earlier, because they're outside of you that I simply can't because of my own blinders. Yeah, I've always had a problem with my appearance.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm attractive. Now, I'm sure there are people out there that think I'm not attractive. And some people try and compliment me by telling me I look like Lionel Richie. I hope no one who's ever listening to this call ever does that. Please don't do that. That does not help my self-esteem. It just doesn't. I'm just saying. But if everyone out there says at a minimum, Scott, you're not the ugliest person to have ever walked the earth, maybe I should say to myself, maybe I'm not the ugliest person that's ever walked the earth. By the way, I've never believed I'm the ugliest person that walked the earth either. And I don't really believe there are ugly
Mhm.
people. I have a problem with that concept. Maybe that's a topic we should talk about one day. It's caused a lot of people a lot of pain.
Mhm.
Other things. Oh, I was recently told that the way I present as a speaker, as a public figure, all these sorts of
Mhm.
things, has a very high degree of male energy within it or coming out. And I've heard that enough that I think there's some truth to it. I don't have a value judgment on that one way or the other. But I after a while, which is one of those things I never thought of until I started hearing this, I can choose to accept that or not.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I
But
just
aren't
don't
you
believe all these
allowing
people
other
are totally
people
just off base.
but aren't you allowing other people to define that then? And why?
Or maybe people are just observing something that I'm not capable of seeing myself.
So, okay, how I'm hearing what you're saying then is that if enough people say it, then it's got to be true. Is that what I'm hearing?
Not necessarily got to, but we need to seriously consider the fact that maybe not everyone out there is deluded. Sometimes the crazy person is the person. Maybe sometimes the crazy person is me.
But how do you know that? How do you know what's the
Well,
threshold
because
for no. This is I'm gonna challenge that because
oh,
how do you
I'll
know
tell you how.
what's the threshold for that number?
I'm look. If I turn around and say there is a boogeyman standing right over my shoulders right now,
Okay.
And that boogeyman looks like something the cat dragged in, ate up, and spit out,
Sure.
and has slobber coming out and yellow eyes.
Okay.
And everyone says, Oleg, you're like, no, there's nothing there. Melody and Jessica are like, no, there's nothing there. All of the regulars come here. And yeah, Jessica, so she's about to tell me about that person behind my back. Please, Jessica, I might start believing you. After a while, might you all not say, Scott's having a problem? Maybe we should have Scott talk to somebody? Because there is clearly nothing there. So the objective observation about the world in which I'm living in, about what is right behind me versus my own, is I can and should freely admit I'm living in a world of delusion. It might be painful to face. I might not like the consequences of it, or I might end up better in life. And if I were to face that and figure out why I'm having this delusion exactly and get some help. But there are people we know that they talk about things that just aren't true. We know that there are people that tell us lies. We know that, or do we?
So
is it possible that no one lies? I mean, come on. I just feel like I feel.
But why is it your job to fix them? Why do you feel the need to fix the other person's perspective?
Because they can come to harm because of it. Because their potential might be limited. And I don't mean just the theoretical potential to live a full, happy, spiritually advancing, and abundant life. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, if you can't see straight, you might walk onto the street and get hurt.
Correct.
Or you might come up and start talking to someone, they'll push you into the subway.
Those I understand. No, so here's how I understand that. I understand that there's situations where I think, I don't think legitimate is the right word, but there's serious, let's say, like fears or dangers. Okay, crossing the street, not being able to see it. Like, I get it. Where the more people that say, "Hey, don't cross the street," and the busy road, probably is helpful. But I think there's a fine line between understanding where you choose to take other people's perspectives into and how they impact your identity. In my opinion, I'm going to take everyone's perspective with a grain of salt when it comes to everything in life. But there's certain things that I will take perspectives not more seriously, but I will take them as things that I will go by. So, for example, crossing the street, looking both ways, the more people that say, "Hey, do that," or, because protection reasons or whatever, that's something I'll accept. Anything that has to do with public appearance, how you dress, what you do with it, how you react, I don't believe in that. I don't subscribe to that theory. I don't care how many people it is, 500, 1,000, it could be the whole world. How I see the world is how I see the world. And I think, if anything, I think there's a fine line between understanding that there's still a choice that one can make in seeing the world, no matter how many influences there are. No matter how many people tell you certain things about your public speaking style, I think that you still have a choice. No, but in all seriousness, I think you still have a choice in how you view yourself. But maybe you sampled the wrong pool. Maybe you sampled the wrong 500 people. You know what I mean?
Let me ask you this. Every now and then, and we've all seen it, and I do not cast judgment as human beings about the situation I'm about to describe.
Sure.
But we've all seen, it's usually a male-female couple who are advanced in their years, often very advanced, but maybe not that advanced. Maybe they're even younger than me. And the man has it always seems to be a man. He's got all his hair coming out of his ears, or he's like not trimmed hair coming out of his nose and it's starting to reach down, or they have like eyebrows with weird things coming down. Yes, I'm being judgmental. And the person may not care. And I will assume, let's assume for the sake of argument, that the wife hasn't said anything.
Yeah.
Right. So you think that the person should be, I don't care about what anyone thinks. I'm going to walk out. I look damn good with this hair, bushy hair coming
Yeah.
10 feet out of my ear, brushing against the side of the door.
Yeah. I absolutely support that because the other perspective is solely your expectation of what the person needs to look like.
Well,
And going back to the concept of truth and universal truth, there is no universal truth when it comes to that. It's solely your perspective and it's my perspective. The
I
same
have
exact
to.
reason why some people choose to trim their nose hair and others don't.
Are you saying my
Who's
nose hair is long right now?
no, no, I'm not able to see it in that detail
Good,
through the webcam, but
because
but you know what I mean?
if
It's
I
like
care about
everyone
your
has
yeah, if my
everyone
nose hair
has
is
their
long, I
own
want to know your
perspective of it.
perspective on it. Better not be that my perspective rules. Your perspective better be,
Your
Scott.
pers- no, your
Get that
life is
hair
your
out of your
life.
face.
Your life is your life, and that's something that this is something I'm trying to really implement more into my day to day. And I really got to thank Thomas for helping me realize this, but challenging my own expectations and assumptions. Why do I think why do I think this person has to wear this? Why do I think this person has to shave and do these? Like, I think there are certain things, don't get me wrong, that I think certain things that are put in place. For example, traffic, if you have a one-way street, yes, I'm not going to argue for the fact that the car should turn around and go the opposite way down a one way. That would disrupt the natural rhythm of things. But I will say that when it comes to things where it's more based on just expectations, so whether you wear a blue color jacket to a restaurant or green, and I may not like one, but I may like the other, I don't believe in that. I don't I because what I'm doing at the same exact time is I'm limiting your self-expression when it comes to that. I'm making the choice for you without giving you the freedom to make the choice on your own. And I think the same applies to your um, facial makeup or the hair or whatever. That's my perspective.
I'm feeling fury, Oleg.
Yeah,
And you know why I'm
that's my
feeling fury?
perspective.
Because I know you're right. I actually agree with you. I just hate it.
Yeah,
I hate
it's
it.
hard
I don't want to agree with you.
because it's hard. It's hard to. This is what I'm learning. It's hard to manage assumptions and expectations because they're prevalent every day. They're prevalent every moment of our lives. If you really think about it, you want something one way, it happens another way. I want something one way, it happens a different way. And it's just that's a harder concept that I've been trying to understand. And it's just like
Oleg, won't you
not
give me
everyone
the
wants what
joy
you
and
want.
pleasure of dominating and controlling your perspective in any way at all?
Never, never.
Just give me that. All
Nope.
I want is domination.
Nope. Everyone has their own expectations.
What you're talking about, Oleg, is the power of a story.
Yeah.
Why is that something you care about so much? Where can people find out more about your thinking on that?
So why do I care about that so much is because I believe that everyone's story can change the world. What I mean by that is I believe it can change the inner world and I do believe that it can change the outer world. How do I know that? Going relating it back to the concept of understanding how I'm alive. I believe that in the past 5 years, I have put myself on a journey where I've been able to change the story around my own circumstances. And I can confidently say that reflecting back upon everything that I've done and who I've become living here in Austin, I found myself. 5 years ago when I came to Austin, I didn't know myself. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what my sense of purpose, my meaning was in the world. 5 years later, I found those things. And that's the biggest thing that I try and pass on to other people is a space for them to find themselves, to find whatever it is that they're passionate about, however it is that their stories impact who they are. And so that's what I try and do through these spaces. And I know you're a part of it, Scott, as well.
Proudly.
We on a weekly basis with Casey and Nicole and Kara and Alicia and so many others. And it started as a podcast. It still is a podcast where people can explore their own personal narratives and understand that there's so many things that contribute to it. So those are two shows that I host. One is called Overcoming Odds. The other one's called The Power of Your Story. And the reason why they exist is because I'm a huge believer in a story. I believe that regardless of what the circumstances you might be facing right now, that there's a different way to experience life, that it's possible to experience another set of circumstances. And one other thing that I'll throw out there before we go into the concept of purpose and meaning is actually an event that Jessica, who has been a contributor of this show for many,
Yes.
many episodes,
Yes.
is featuring our organization at, and that is,
Yes.
if you're able to see at the bottom, through her show called The Breakthrough Show, where Overcoming Odds, along with another organization, will be a part of. So just wanted to highlight that at the bottom for anyone that's listening or anyone that wants to support what we're doing through our organization. Feel free to check it out, and many of the proceeds will go directly towards us as well as the other ones. So I just want to applaud her for doing that.
Jessica, this squirrel may have been having some anger management issues tonight, but my gratitude for you for doing this, it is bottomless.
Mm-hmm. And there's purpose within that anger management, right, Scott?
The lack of anger management is my car crash on the purpose highway. Fortunately, I can get right back on and drive on to the next destination. Yes, Oleg, I believe we are in the middle of a silent revolution.
Mm-hmm.
It is a complete transformation in the nature of belief. The old institutions that have propped up our ethics, our spirituality, and our connection through the search for meaning are in decline. And there's a silent plague of alienation that has come because of that change.
Mm-hmm.
Scott Mason's Purpose Highway, URL right below, explores alternative pathways for movements to create a sense of connection through meaning in a world where the old paradigms are gone for good. So I ask you to check it out, think, and as is the case with Overcoming Odds or The Power of Your Story, leave us a review on Apple, like us, subscribe, and for anyone who might be watching or listening to this at any point in the future, this being this particular show, make sure you do the same on Facebook and support our sponsor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to say as we conclude this this particular episode, this discussion has really opened up my eyes to quite a bit, and the people that have been a part of it, Jessica, Melody, and anyone else that's listening, really helped me broaden my own perspective.
Yeah.
I came into it thinking that being alive meant one thing, and I'm walking away with a completely different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the biggest thing that I'll also point out as we conclude this particular conversation is that there's so much about this world that I don't know. But yet having the desire to continue to learn, having the understanding that I will always be a work in progress, I will always be that squirrel looking for that nut, trying to get out of the rut, is something that is fascinating to observe and just to experience. And I hope that anyone else that's listening may feel similar.